Imagine a man so brilliant that one of the greatest scholars of Islamic history, Imam Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, wrote an entire book just to defend him. Now imagine that same man being called, by other equally great scholars, a shaitan in human form, a zindiq, a kafir whose books deserve to be burned. Same man, same books, same doctrine. One camp calls him Shaykh al-Akbar, the greatest master. The other camp calls him the man who nearly destroyed Islamic theology from the inside. For over 700 years, Muslims have been unable to agree on a single verdict about him. Entire libraries have been written just arguing about whether one man, Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, was a saint of the highest order, or a heretic dressed in the robe of a saint. Tonight, we are not going to run away from that fight. We are going to walk straight into it. We are going to ask the most dangerous question in Islamic intellectual history. Was Ibn Arabi a heretic? And to answer that, we have to understand the doctrine that started the entire war, Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being. By the end of this talk, you will understand exactly why this controversy exploded, who stood on which side, what the doctrine actually says, not what people assume it says, and why, even today in the 21st century, this 600-year-old argument still shapes how millions of Muslims think about God, about creation, and about the line between the creator and the created. So sit with me. Because this is not just history, this is theology with consequences. Let's begin. Before we touch the controversy, we need to meet the man at the center of it. Muhammad ibn Ali ibn Muhammad ibn al-Arabi al-Hatimi al-Tai was born in the year 560 after Hijrah, 1165 in the Christian calendar, in the city of Murcia, in the region we today call Spain, then under the rule of the Almohad Caliphate. He is usually distinguished from another famous scholar with a nearly identical name, the Maliki judge Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, by simply calling him Ibn Arabi without the definite article al, although interestingly, he himself signed his name with the al. He carried the title Muhyiddin, the reviver of the faith, given to him by his admirers. And his most famous title, the one etched into Islamic intellectual history forever, is al-Shaykh al-Akbar, the greatest master. This was not a man who lived a quiet, obscure life on the margins of Islamic scholarship. Ibn Arabi trained extensively in the Islamic sciences. He studied hadith. He studied jurisprudence. Scholars who consider him a saint, like the contemporary Shafi scholar Shaykh Nuha Mim Keller, describe him as a mujtahid imam, a scholar of independent legal reasoning in Sharia, in Tasawwuf, in Tafsir, and in Hadith. He traveled from Andalusia across North Africa through Mecca, and eventually settled and died in Damascus in the year 638 AH, 1240 CE, where his tomb still stands today, and where centuries later the Ottoman Sultan Selim Iced would build a mosque in his honor after conquering the city, specifically because he believed in Ibn Arabi's sainthood. Now here is the astonishing part. This was not a man who wrote a pamphlet or two. Ibn Arabi is estimated to have authored several hundred works. Some scholars count over 300, others push the number even higher when you include shorter treatises. His two most important and most controversial works are Fusus al-Hikam, the Bezels of Wisdom, and his monumental, multi-volume masterpiece al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan Openings, a work so vast that modern critical editions run into dozens of volumes. There's a story from his youth that biographers love to repeat, because it captures the strangeness of this man so well. As a young man in Andalusia, Ibn Arabi reportedly met the great philosopher Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, the towering rationalist commentator on Aristotle. The story goes that Ibn Rushd, hearing of the young mystic's spiritual openings, asked to meet him. According to the traditional account preserved in Ibn Arabi's own later writings, Ibn Rushd asked the young man whether the illumination he had reached through mystical unveiling agreed with what philosophers reach through rational speculation. Ibn Arabi's answer was famously cryptic, something to the effect of yes and no. Between the yes and the no, spirits take flight from their matter and heads are separated from their bodies. It's a small story, but it tells you something important. From the very beginning of his life, Ibn Arabi was a man who refused to give simple one-word answers to the deepest questions. That same refusal is exactly what would later ignite the controversy we are discussing tonight. Ibn Arabi also described his own spiritual formation as involving direct visionary experience. He wrote of receiving al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, quite literally, the Meccan openings, as a result of spiritual unveilings he experienced while circling the Kaaba in Mecca. This is important context, because it tells you that Ibn Arabi himself did not present his most controversial ideas as ordinary rational philosophy, arrived at through logical deduction. He presented them as kashf, unveiling, direct spiritual disclosure. And that distinction matters enormously for how we evaluate the controversy, because it changes the entire register of the claim. A philosopher who makes a logical error can simply be corrected with better logic. A mystic who claims direct unveiling is making an entirely different kind of truth claim, one that is far harder to verify and far easier to dispute. And it is inside these books, particularly Fusus al-Hikam, that the seeds of 7 centuries of controversy were planted. Here's something that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Ibn Arabi never actually used the exact phrase Wahdat al-Wujud in his writings. According to the Encyclopedia of Religion, the term appears to have been first explicitly attributed to him not by his supporters, but by his greatest critic, the formidable jurist and theologian Ibn Taymiyyah, who died in 728 AA, roughly a century after Ibn Arabi's death, so think about that for a second. The label that has followed Ibn Arabi for 700 years, the label his critics used to condemn him and his followers used to describe his philosophy, was coined, in large part, by the very man who was trying to destroy his reputation. That alone should tell you how loaded, how politically and theologically charged this term has always been. So what does Wahdat al-Wujud actually mean? Literally, it translates to the oneness of being, or the unity of existence. At the most basic level, all Muslims already agree that Allah is one, that is Tawhid, the very first pillar of the Islamic creed. Nobody disputes that. The controversy isn't over whether God is one. It's over the word wujud, existence or being. Here's where it gets dangerous. In everyday Arabic, wujud is also the word used for the existence of ordinary things. The existence of a tree, a mountain, a human being, the whole physical universe around us. So when Ibn Arabi's school speaks of the oneness of existence, the alarming question immediately arises. Are they saying that God's existence and the universe's existence are literally the same thing? That everything we see around us, you, me, this room, the sky above us, is not merely created by God but somehow literally is God? If that's what it means, then yes, that would be catastrophic heresy. It would collapse the entire distinction between creator and creation that sits at the absolute foundation of Islamic monotheism. It would resemble a kind of pantheism, closer to certain strands of Hindu Vedanta philosophy than to the Quranic vision of a transcendent God who is not like anything. As the Quran itself declares in Surah al-Shura verse 11, Laisa kamithlihi shay'un, there is nothing like unto him. This is exactly the reading that Ibn Arabi's harshest critics adopted. And once you understand what's at stake, you understand why this became one of the fiercest theological battles in Islamic history. Because if the accusation is true, this isn't a minor doctrinal disagreement. This strikes at the very heart of what it means to be a Muslim. But, and this is critical, Ibn Arabi's defenders insist this reading is a catastrophic misunderstanding. We'll get to their argument. First, we need one more piece of vocabulary, because without it, the whole debate is impossible to follow properly. Islamic theology actually already has a name for the bad version of what Ibn Arabi's critics fear. It's called ittihad, meaning full union or fusion between two separate things into one, or hulul, meaning divine indwelling. The idea that God literally comes to dwell inside a created thing or person. Both ittihad and hulul are unambiguously and unanimously rejected in mainstream Islamic theology. No defender of Ibn Arabi, however passionate, argues otherwise. The entire question, then, is whether Wahdat al-Wujud is simply ittihad and hulul wearing a fancier name, which is exactly what Ibn Taymiyyah argued, or whether it is a fundamentally different, more careful claim about how a transcendent God manifests his attributes throughout creation without literally merging his essence into it, which is what al-Suyuti and al-Sha'rani argued. Everything that follows in this debate really comes down to that single fork in the road. Let's be honest with the audience tonight. The case against Ibn Arabi is not some fringe conspiracy theory whispered by uneducated extremists. Some of the most rigorous, most respected minds in Islamic history stood in the courtroom against him. The chief prosecutor, without question, is Ibn Taymiyyah. In his enormous body of fatwas, collected in Majmu al-Fatawa, Ibn Taymiyyah argued that the followers of Wahdat al-Wujud were, in his words, giving people the drink of disbelief and atheism in the vessels of the prophets, wearing the outward garments of righteous strugglers, while secretly waging war against Allah and his messenger. That is a brutal accusation. Ibn Taymiyyah argued that Ibn Arabi's doctrine collapsed into what Islamic theology calls ittihad, a full union or identification between the creator and creation, the exact opposite of Tawhid. According to Ibn Taymiyyah's reading, Ibn Arabi was teaching that Allah has no existence separate from created things, that Allah is all of existence, and there is no existence besides him, in a way that erases the creator-creation distinction entirely. Ibn Taymiyyah was not alone. His student, the great historian and scholar Ibn Kathir, wrote about Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam in his monumental history al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya, stating plainly that it contains many statements whose apparent meaning is explicit kufr. Then there is Ibn Abi al-Izz al-Hanafi, the famous commentator on the great Hanafi creedal text al-Aqida al-Tahawiyah. In his commentary, he described Ibn Arabi and those who followed his path as hypocrites and heretical zindiks. Perhaps the most systematic and dedicated opponent was the 15th century Egyptian scholar Burhan al-Din al-Bikai, who authored an entire book against Ibn Arabi, with a title that leaves absolutely nothing to the imagination. Tanbih al-Gabi ila takfir Ibn Arabi, warning to the ignoramus concerning the declaration of Ibn Arabi's disbelief. Al-Bikai argued that Ibn Arabi, along with two other controversial mystics, Ibn Sabin and Ibn al-Farid, had effectively equated the existence of the Creator with the existence of creation itself. And the list doesn't stop there. The great biographer Imam al-Dhahabi, in his monumental work Siyar Alam al-Nubala, wrote about the fusus with a line that has been quoted for centuries. If there is no kafir in this book, then there is no kafir anywhere in the world. A Hanafi jurist named Qudi Ismail ibn Abi Bakr went even further, declaring that whoever doubts the disbelief of the followers of Ibn Arabi is himself a disbeliever, putting Ibn Arabi's followers in the same theological category as those entirely outside the fold of Islam. Later, the Ottoman-era scholar Mullah Ali al-Qari wrote a formal refutation titled Al-Rad al-Qailin bi Wahdat al-Wujud, in which he stated that whoever truly adopts Ibn Arabi's creed is, by consensus, a disbeliever without dispute now. Why does this matter so much to us tonight? Because these are not marginal figures. Ibn Taymiyyah remains one of the most influential jurists in Islamic history, whose works form the backbone of many modern reform and revivalist movements. Ibn Kathir's tafsir is one of the most widely read Quranic commentaries in the world today. Al-Dhahabi is considered one of the greatest hadith critics and historians Islam has ever produced. When minds of this caliber unite in condemnation, you cannot simply dismiss it as jealousy or misunderstanding. Something in Ibn Arabi's writing, something in his language, in his metaphysical formulations, genuinely alarmed some of the sharpest theological minds in Islamic history. Let me give you the single most notorious example, because it explains exactly why critics reacted the way they did. In Fusus al-Hikam, in the chapter dealing with the Prophet Musa, Moses ibn Arabi makes a genuinely shocking claim. He suggests that Pharaoh, the very man the Quran repeatedly condemns as the arch-tyrant who claimed divinity for himself, died in a state of true faith, because in his final moments, drowning in the sea, Pharaoh declared belief in the God of Musa. Critics like Ibn Kathir pointed directly at passages like this as a clear contradiction of explicit Quranic verses that describe Pharaoh's punishment and disbelief without ambiguity. To a critic reading this literally, it looks like Ibn Arabi is rehabilitating one of the Quran's clearest villains, and if a mystic is willing to overturn that plain a Quranic judgment through esoteric reinterpretation, critics ask, what Islamic teaching is safe from being redefined into its opposite? Defenders respond that this episode has to be read the same way as everything else in the Fusus, as an exploration of technical theological subtleties around the precise moment and validity of a deathbed declaration of faith, a question jurists across Islamic history have actually debated in other contexts, not as Ibn Arabi personally rehabilitating tyranny, but you can see immediately why, even among people willing to extend Ibn Arabi enormous benefit of the doubt on abstract metaphysics. A passage like this landed as a genuine scandal. It's concrete, it names a Quranic figure by name, and it appears to contradict the plain sense of revealed text, which is precisely the kind of specific quotable evidence that fueled the fatwas of takfir for centuries. So if the case against him is this strong, how did Ibn Arabi survive as a revered spiritual master at all? How does a mosque get built over his grave by a Muslim sultan? This is where the defense takes the stand. Here's the twist that most people never hear about. The defense of Ibn Arabi is just as scholarly, just as rigorous, and involves names just as towering as the prosecution. The most famous defender is Imam Jalal al-Din al-Suyuti, who died in 911 AH. Al-Suyuti is not some minor figure. He is one of the most prolific scholars in all of Islamic history, a master of hadith, tafsir, Arabic philology, and jurisprudence, whose works are still standard references today. When his own teacher, the aforementioned al-Bikai, wrote his book declaring Ibn Arabi a disbeliever, al-Suyuti fired back with a direct rebuttal, a booklet titled Tanbih al-Gabi bi Tabriyat Ibn Arabi, warning to the ignoramus concerning Ibn Arabi's vindication, a deliberate mirroring of his teacher's title. Flipping the accusation on its head, in this work, al-Suyuti made a fascinating observation. He said that scholars past and present had differed sharply concerning Ibn Arabi. One group considered him a true wali, a saint and friend of Allah, and in al-Suyuti's own assessment, this group was correct. This group included respected figures like Ibn Ata'Allah al-Sakandari, the celebrated author of the Hikam, and Afif al-Din al-Yafi, A second group, largely composed optists, considered him a heretic. And a third group simply expressed uncertainty. Al-Suyuti didn't stop at opinion. He drew on the biographical record of the Hadith master Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, himself an enormously respected authority, who had compiled, in his historical work Inba al-Gum, a list of trusted scholars who held a good opinion of Ibn Arabi or explicitly counted him among the saints. That list includes Ibn Ata Allah al-Sakandari, al-Yafi. The great jurist is Ibn Abd al-Salam, known as the Sultan of Scholars, after his reported meeting with the Sufi master al-Shadhili, and even the towering lexicographer al-Fairuzabadi, the author of the famous dictionary al-Qamus al-Muhit, who died in 818 AA. Think about that name for a second. Al-Fairuzabadi. This is a man whose dictionary is still consulted by Arabic scholars today, whose command of the Arabic language is virtually unmatched in Islamic history. If a man of that linguistic precision read Ibn Arabi's words and did not conclude explicit kufr, that carries real weight in the debate over how Ibn Arabi's technical vocabulary should actually be interpreted. Al-Suyuti's defense also made an argument about method. He said that Ibn Arabi's writings are not meant to be read by lay people encountering Sufi technical terminology for the first time. According to this camp, if you read the phrase Wahdat al-Wujud, the same way you'd read an ordinary sentence in a newspaper, you will absolutely misread it as blasphemy. But if you understand it as technical Sufi vocabulary, a specialized language developed within the discipline of tasawwuf, much like every science has its own jargon, the meaning shifts entirely. Then came a second great defender in the 16th century, the Egyptian scholar Imam Abd al-Wahhab al-Sha'rani. In his book al-Yawaqit wal-Jawahir fi Bayan Aqaid al-Akabir, al-Sha'rani attempted something remarkable, a theological reconciliation between the formal science of kalam and the mystical insights of tasawwuf. According to modern academic analysis of this text, al-Sha'rani essentially built a synthesis between two core theological concepts, Tanzi, God's absolute transcendence and utter dissimilarity from creation, and Tashbih, the ways in which God's attributes are reflected or mirrored within creation. His argument, in short, was that Ibn Arabi was not collapsing Tanzi into Tashbih. He was holding both truths simultaneously, the way orthodox Ash'ari theology itself does when it says God's attributes are neither God nor other than God. This is actually a crucial point that the Encyclopedia of Religion highlights directly. Defenders of Wahdat al-Wujud argue that the doctrine, properly understood, follows exactly the same delicate logical structure as mainstream Ash'ari theology regarding divine attributes. Standard Sunni Ash'ari doctrine already teaches a paradox. God's attributes, his knowledge, his power, his will, are neither identical to his essence nor something entirely separate and other than him. God's signs and traces in creation are, in this framework, neither the same as God nor different from him, because God must be understood simultaneously as both present and absent, both transcendent and immanent. If mainstream Sunni theology already accepts this kind of paradox regarding divine attributes, defenders argue, then Wahdat al-Wujud, properly, technically understood, is simply extending that same logic to the entire cosmos. Creation is God's self-disclosure, his self-manifestation, without literally being God in the crude materialistic sense that critics feared. To make this a little more concrete, think of it through an analogy Ibn Arabi's defenders themselves often reach for. Sunlight, and its reflection in 1,000 different mirrors scattered across a room. The light in every mirror is genuinely, truly sunlight. It isn't a different, lesser substance manufactured by the mirror itself. In that sense, you could poetically say, there is only one light in this room. And yet no sane person would conclude from that image that the mirrors themselves have become the sun, or that the sun has been divided up and distributed piece by piece among the mirrors, losing its own separate, transcendent reality up in the sky. Defenders of Wahdat al-Wujud argue that this is roughly the logical shape of Ibn Arabi's claim. Creation reflects and manifests the divine names and attributes so genuinely and so completely that from a certain elevated mystical vantage point, one can meaningfully say there is nothing in existence but God's self-disclosure, without that claim collapsing into the crude assertion that the mirror and the sun are now materially, ontologically one and the same thing. Critics, for their part, don't find this analogy fully reassuring, and it's worth being honest about why. They point out that analogies are not proofs, and that Ibn Arabi's own texts in places go considerably further than a simple reflection metaphor would require, using language of genuine identity, not mere resemblance. This is really the crux of 7 centuries of close textual argument. Does Ibn Arabi's actual Arabic, read across the full body of his work rather than in isolated quotations, support the cautious reflection reading? Or does it support the more radical identity reading that alarmed Ibn Taymiyyah? Trained specialists on both sides have marshaled hundreds of pages of textual evidence for their respective positions, and that specific philological argument, line by line, chapter by chapter, is genuinely still unsettled among experts today. And here's a detail that should make us pause and reconsider the whole picture. Ibn Taymiyyah himself, our chief prosecutor, is on record elsewhere making a striking concession. According to later scholarship on this dispute, Ibn Taymiyyah acknowledged that there were, in fact, different levels and different articulations of oneness of being among the Sufis, some acceptable within orthodoxy, and some genuinely heretical. His fiercest attacks were reserved specifically for what he understood to be a materialistic, literalist misreading of the doctrine, precisely the crude pantheistic version that Ibn Arabi's defenders also reject. So even within Ibn Taymiyyah's own body of work, the picture is more layered than a simple blanket condemnation. Now here's where the story gets even more fascinating, and this is a part almost nobody outside specialist circles knows. Roughly 3.5 centuries after Ibn Arabi's death, a towering Indian Sufi scholar named Shaykh Ahmad Sirhindi, a leading figure of the Naqshbandi order, entered the debate with something genuinely original. Sirhindi is remembered by his followers with the immense title Mujaddid al-Thani, the reviver of the second Islamic millennium. Sirhindi didn't simply pick a side. He proposed an alternative framework entirely, Wahdat al-Shuhud, the unity of witnessing or unity of perception, as opposed to Ibn Arabi's Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being. Here's the distinction in plain language, because this is genuinely one of the most elegant resolutions in the history of this debate. According to Sirhindi's formulation, the mystic who reaches the highest spiritual states does not perceive that everything is God in an ontological metaphysical sense. Rather, in the overwhelming intensity of that spiritual experience, it merely appears or feels to the perceiving mystic as though everything is God. Because the mystic's consciousness, in that ecstatic state, is so overwhelmed and absorbed by divine reality that the distinctions of the created world momentarily vanish from perception. But, and this is the crucial correction, this is a matter of subjective spiritual experience, not objective metaphysical fact. The creation genuinely remains distinct from the creator. Sirhindi's famous reformulation is captured in the phrase, "Believers must realize that everything is from God," rather than the more dangerous-sounding claim that everything is God. Remarkably, Sirhindi did not frame this as a total demolition of Ibn Arabi. Historical accounts note that Sirhindi remained in many respects an admirer of Ibn Arabi, even as he pushed back against what he saw as the metaphysical dangers of taking Wahdat al-Wujud too literally. According to the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society's own scholarship on this subject, Sirhindi stated explicitly that Ibn Arabi was the one who formulated the idea of the oneness of being, analyzed it, and set down its syntax and grammar, a description that, depending on how you read it, sounds almost like a backhanded compliment, an acknowledgement of Ibn Arabi's genius, wrapped in a warning about the doctrine's danger in unqualified hands. Sirhindi's Wahdat al-Shuhud went on to become hugely influential, especially, as scholarly sources note, within the Naqshbandi order, spreading through Central Asia, Turkey, and the Arab lands, precisely because it offered a way to honor the depth of the mystical experience Ibn Arabi described while placing firm guardrails around it, anchored tightly to obedience to Sharia and Sunnah as the necessary path to genuine spiritual realization. It's worth pausing on why this mattered so much practically, beyond the abstract theology. Sirhindi was writing at a specific historical moment, Mughal India under Emperor Akbar and his successors, an era in which certain court-influenced religious movements were flirting with syncretism, blending elements of different religious traditions in ways many orthodox scholars found alarming. Sirhindi's letters, collected as the Maktubat, weren't written in a vacuum. They were written by a man deeply concerned that an over-literal, poorly supervised reading of Wahdat al-Wujud could feed directly into exactly that kind of syncretistic drift, the idea that, since everything is God anyway, the specific form of religious practice hardly matters. Sirhindi's insistence on Sharia as the non-negotiable outer boundary of any legitimate mystical path was in that sense as much a practical corrective aimed at his own historical moment, as it was an abstract metaphysical refinement of Ibn Arabi's system. It's also worth noting that Sirhindi's own position did not go entirely unchallenged either. Later Naqshbandi scholars and other Sufi masters continued debating whether Wahdat al-Shuhud was truly a correction of Ibn Arabi, a lower stage on the spiritual path that eventually culminates in Wahdat al-Wujud, or simply a different vocabulary describing the same underlying reality from a different angle. Even some of Sirhindi's own later followers softened his sharper formulations over time. suggesting that the fierce opposition between the two doctrines may have been, in practice, less absolute than Sirhindi's initial framing suggested. In other words, even the solution to the controversy became its own smaller controversy. That's how deep this rabbit hole genuinely goes. So by the time you reach the 17th and 18th centuries, the Islamic world isn't simply split into pro-Ibn Arabi and anti-Ibn Arabi camps. There's a serious, respected third position, one that tries to preserve the mystical insight while diffusing the theological danger. Let's step back for a moment and ask, why did this particular doctrine, out of everything in the vast ocean of Islamic mysticism, become the single most explosive controversy in Sufi intellectual history? I think there are three real reasons, and understanding them helps us understand why intelligent, sincere scholars ended up on opposite sides of this war. First, the language itself is genuinely, deliberately paradoxical. Ibn Arabi did not write in simple declarative prose. His works are dense with symbolic language, poetic paradox, and layered meanings operating on multiple levels simultaneously. This is not an accident. Mystical literature across many traditions relies on this kind of language, precisely because it's trying to point toward an experience of God that ordinary, literal language cannot fully capture. But the same feature that makes his writing profound to a trained reader makes it genuinely dangerous in the hands of an untrained one. Al-Suyuti himself made this exact point in his defense. Ibn Arabi's books were, in his words, forbidden to those who read them without first learning the technical terms used by the Sufis. Second, this is a doctrine with massive stakes. This isn't an argument over a minor point of ritual practice. It goes straight to the definition of Tawhid itself, the absolute core of Islamic belief. When the stakes are this high, scholars on both sides felt a genuine religious duty to take a firm, uncompromising stand. Because if you believe the dangerous reading was correct, silence would mean allowing people to slide into what you sincerely believed was disbelief. And if you believed the doctrine was being catastrophically misunderstood, silence would mean allowing a true saint's legacy and a profound spiritual science to be slandered and destroyed. Before we get to the third reason, let me add one more layer that rarely gets discussed but genuinely matters. The sheer size of Ibn Arabi's output made consistency almost impossible to guarantee. Remember, we're talking about a man credited with several hundred works, including a multi-volume masterwork running into the thousands of pages in modern print. When a writer produces that much material, over decades, across changing stages of spiritual and intellectual development, some degree of internal tension or apparent contradiction between different passages becomes almost inevitable, even for the most careful author. Critics could always find a passage that, read in isolation, sounded alarming. Defenders could always find a neighboring passage or a clarifying statement elsewhere in the same vast corpus that softened or reframed it. Both sides were, in a very real sense, quoting the same ocean of text. They were simply diving into different parts of it. Third, the debate got entangled with power and politics. It's worth remembering, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I, after conquering Damascus, specifically ordered the restoration of Ibn Arabi's tomb and built a mosque and complex around it, publicly affirming Ibn Arabi's sainthood as a matter of imperial religious policy. That's not a neutral academic decision. That's a state using its authority to settle, or at least heavily influence, a theological dispute. Meanwhile, in other regions and eras, scholars aligned with more literalist, Hanbali-influenced currents used their own institutional authority to push the opposite verdict. When theology intersects with political power, the correct answer often becomes entangled with who happens to be holding influence in a given century and region. It would be incomplete to leave this discussion purely in the medieval and early modern period. This debate is very much alive in contemporary Islamic scholarship, and it has also become a serious subject of academic study in the Western study of religion. The most significant contemporary academic voice here is the American scholar of Islamic studies, William Chittick, whose translations and studies of Ibn Arabi, including his landmark work analyzing the term Wahdat al-Wujud across 7 distinct historical interpretations, are considered foundational in modern Ibn Arabi scholarship. Chittick's research demonstrates something important for us tonight. The phrase Wahdat al-Wujud has never had one single fixed, universally agreed, meaning even among people using the exact same words. Critics, defenders, and later commentators have all loaded the term with different technical content, depending on their theological starting point. This tells us something vital. Much of this 7th century war was not simply a disagreement about facts, but frequently a disagreement about definitions. People were, in some real sense, arguing past each other, using an identical phrase to mean different things. On the more traditionalist and Salafi-oriented side of contemporary scholarship, the criticism of Ibn Arabi remains very much alive and, if anything, has hardened. Contemporary polemical works continue to circulate collections of the historical condemnations we discussed earlier, from Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Kathir, al-Dhahabi, and others, presenting them as a decisive, near-unanimous scholarly consensus against Ibn Arabi's creed. These modern presentations tend to argue that Ibn Arabi's true intent was carefully concealed, cloaked in ambiguous language precisely so that it could survive scrutiny while still transmitting what they consider a fundamentally un-Islamic, near-pantheistic theology. On the other side, in traditional Sufi orders and among many contemporary scholars trained in the classical Ash'ari Maturidi and Sufi tradition, including respected voices like Shaykh Keller, whom we mentioned earlier, the defense continues in the same spirit as al-Suyuti and al-Sha'rani. Ibn Arabi remains venerated as al-Shaykh al-Akbar, a towering saint whose metaphysics, when properly studied under qualified teachers, reveals profound harmony with orthodox Islamic belief rather than contradiction to it. What's fascinating is that both camps claim the mantle of orthodoxy. Both camps claim to be protecting the purity of Tawhid. Neither side thinks of itself as the innovator. Each side believes it is defending the authentic Islamic tradition against a genuine threat, whether that threat is heretical mysticism on one side or the flattening, literalist destruction of a profound spiritual science on the other. There's also a third, quieter camp worth mentioning: Western academic scholars of Islamic studies, who approach the question not as believers trying to reach a religious verdict, but as historians and philologists trying to understand what Ibn Arabi actually meant in his own historical and linguistic context. Scholars in this tradition, Heretic, along with figures like the French scholar Michel Chodkiewicz, who did extensive critical work on Ibn Arabi's spiritual genealogy and hierarchy of saints, generally converge on a shared conclusion: that flattening Ibn Arabi's metaphysics into either simple pantheism or simple orthodox Ash'arism does real violence to the actual complexity of his system. Ibn Arabi built an intricate architecture involving concepts like alayan al-thabita, the fixed entities or eternal archetypes of all things as they exist within God's knowledge before creation, and al-insan al-kamil, the perfect human being, understood as the complete mirror through which the divine names and attributes become fully manifest in creation. These are not simple ideas that reduce neatly into a one-line accusation of heresy or a one-line certificate of orthodoxy. They are a whole cosmological system, and academic scholars generally argue that any fair verdict requires actually working through that system on its own terms, rather than isolating a handful of quotable, alarming-sounding lines. That said, this academic, descriptive approach to the question, simply describing what Ibn Arabi meant historically, is itself a different exercise from the religious normative question we started with tonight. Is this doctrine compatible with Islamic orthodoxy? Yes or no? A historian can tell you precisely what Ibn Arabi intended by a phrase. That same historian, wearing a historian's hat, generally will not tell you whether that intention is theologically acceptable, because that second question belongs to the scholars of Usul al-Din, not to the university seminar room. Keeping those two different questions separate is, frankly, one of the most useful tools anyone can carry out of tonight's discussion, because a huge amount of online arguing about Ibn Arabi collapses the two together without anyone noticing. Before we get to the final verdict, let me quickly clear away 3 myths I hear constantly whenever this topic comes up, because they distort the whole picture. Myth 1: Wahdat al-Wujud means Ibn Arabi believed a tree, a rock, or a human being is literally God. We've already seen this isn't a technical claim his defenders make. The distinction between saying everything is a manifestation of God's attributes and saying everything is identical in essence to God is exactly the line that separates orthodox Sufi metaphysics from actual pantheism, and it is precisely the line al-Sha'rani spent an entire book carefully walking. Myth 2: every single major scholar in Islamic history condemned Ibn Arabi. This simply isn't accurate, and we've spent the last several minutes proving it isn't. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's own biographical dictionary, a towering, meticulous work of hadith scholarship, preserved a substantial list of trusted scholars who held Ibn Arabi in high esteem. Al-Suyuti, arguably one of the most encyclopedic scholars Sunni Islam has ever produced, defended him directly, book against book, footnote against footnote. Myth 3: this is just an old dead argument with no relevance today. It isn't. This exact fault line, how literally to read mystical, symbolic, religious language, and how much authority esoteric spiritual experience should have relative to the plain apparent sense of scripture, is still one of the defining tensions between different currents of the Muslim world today. From Salafi-oriented reform movements to Sufi orders spanning from Morocco to Indonesia. Every time someone argues online about whether Sufi shrine visitation, or Sufi metaphysical poetry, or a particular saint's teaching is orthodox or heretical, some piece of the 700-year-old Ibn Arabi controversy is quietly running in the background of that argument, whether the people arguing realize it or not. Now we arrive at the question you came here for. And I owe you honesty rather than a comfortable, easy answer, because the honest answer is this. There is no single verdict that the Muslim intellectual tradition has ever agreed upon, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest to 700 years of serious scholarship on both sides. But here is what I think we can say with confidence. Having walked through all of this evidence together tonight, we can say that Ibn Arabi was not a fringe figure making careless throwaway claims. He was a formidably trained scholar in the traditional Islamic sciences, whose writings on jurisprudence, hadith, and Quranic exegesis were taken seriously even by many of those who ultimately rejected his metaphysics. We can say that the language he used, dense, paradoxical, deliberately resistant to superficial reading, is exactly the kind of language that produces radically divergent interpretations depending on the reader's training, intention, and theological starting point. That is not necessarily evidence of deceit. It may equally be evidence of someone attempting to describe an experience of God that exceeds the boundaries of ordinary literal language. A challenge mystics across many religious traditions have wrestled with for centuries. We can say that when read through the most uncharitable literalist lens, treating Wahdat al-Wujud as a claim that the physical universe and God are materially, ontologically identical, it absolutely would constitute a serious deviation from Islamic monotheism. And the alarm of scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Kathir, and al-Dhahabi was not manufactured out of thin air. It reflects a real theological danger they perceived and took seriously. And we can equally say that when read through the framework his own defenders provide, as a technical Sufi articulation of God's transcendence and immanence, closely parallel to mainstream Ash'ari attribute theology, requiring specialized training to interpret correctly, the doctrine can be understood in a way fully reconcilable with orthodox Tawhid, exactly as al-Suyuti, al-Sha'rani, Ibn Hajar cited scholars, and countless Sufi orders across the centuries have maintained. Perhaps the wisest position in the end belongs to neither extreme, but to that middle path we discussed. Ahmad Sirhindi's Wahdat al-Shuhud, which honored the depth of Ibn Arabi's mystical insight while insisting firmly that the creator-creation distinction must never be dissolved even in the most overwhelming spiritual states. And perhaps the most important thing this entire controversy teaches us, regardless of which side you personally find more convincing, is a lesson about intellectual humility. If scholars of the caliber of Ibn Taymiyyah, al-Dhahabi, and Ibn Kathir on one side, and al-Suyuti, al-Sha'rani, Ibn Ata'Allah al-Sakandari, and al-Fairuzabadi on the other, could study the exact same texts and arrive at diametrically opposed conclusions about something this fundamental, then perhaps the rest of us should approach this question with far more caution, far more study, and far less certainty than social media debates and quick online fatwas tend to allow. 700 years. That's how long this question has been alive. 700 years of some of the greatest minds Islam has ever produced. Jurists, hadith masters, historians, linguists, mystics, pouring their intellects into a single question. What did one man mean when he wrote about the oneness of being? Tonight, we didn't come here to hand you a verdict on a silver platter. We came here to hand you something more valuable. The actual evidence, the actual names, the actual books, the actual arguments that built this controversy brick by brick, century by century. Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Kathir on one side, al-Suyuti and al-Sha'rani on the other. Ahmad Sirhindi standing in the middle, trying to save what he could from both extremes. So I'll leave you with this. The next time someone tells you with total confidence, in a single sentence, that Ibn Arabi was definitely a heretic, or just as confidently, that anyone who criticizes Ibn Arabi simply doesn't understand Sufism, I want you to remember tonight. I want you to remember that this question consumed some of the sharpest theological minds in Islamic history for 7 centuries, and they never fully agreed. Maybe that's uncomfortable. Maybe you wanted a clean, simple answer walking out of here tonight. But real Islamic scholarship, the kind practiced by Suyuti and Ibn Taymiyyah and Sha'rani and Sirhindi, was never about comfortable, simple answers. It was about wrestling honestly with hard questions, with humility, with evidence, and with respect for the sheer difficulty of speaking accurately about the nature of God. That is the real truth about Wahdat al-Wujud, not a verdict. An invitation to study, to question, and to think deeply before you ever speak with false certainty about the mysteries at the very edge of human understanding. Let me leave you with one more thought before we close, because I think it's the most important one of the whole evening. Notice something about every single scholar we discussed tonight: Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Kathir, al-Dhahabi, al-Suyuti, al-Sha'rani, Ibn Hajar, Sirhindi. Every one of them actually read the books before forming a verdict. Every one of them engaged with primary texts in the original Arabic, with the full technical vocabulary of the disciplines involved: jurisprudence, hadith criticism, theology, and the specialized language of tasawwuf. None of them formed their opinion from a two-line quote stripped of context, screenshotted and shared without any of the surrounding argument. That is the real discipline this controversy demands of us today, in an age when it is easier than ever to encounter a single alarming sentence attributed to a 700-year-old mystic, with no idea what chapter it's from, no idea what question it's answering, and no idea what technical vocabulary is doing the heavy lifting in that sentence. If there's one practical takeaway from tonight, it's this: whatever conclusion you eventually reach about Ibn Arabi, saint, heretic, or something more complicated than either label allows, reach it the way Suyuti and Ibn Taymiyyah did. Through the books, through the evidence, through the long, patient, sometimes uncomfortable work of actually reading before you judge. 700 years from now, someone may still be standing where I'm standing tonight, still asking this exact question. And if that's true, then maybe the most honest thing any of us can do in this moment is not to hand down a final verdict, but to keep the question alive, keep it honest, and keep it grounded in the actual text rather than in the noise that surrounds them. Thank you.